functioning of your body. So it's just a joint term to mean everything about all the cellular processes that are going on in your body. And normal metabolism involves all your individual cells sending signals to each other, both within the same organ and between different organs, so that they can all behave in a very coordinated way. Okay, so it's a little bit like an orchestra being conducted. You know, it wouldn't sound very good without the conductor to make all the instruments play at the right time. And all the cellular processes in your body are very similar. They all need to be conducted in a way so that everything happens at the right time in the right place. A normal metabolism enables our bodies to maintain a constant internal environment. That's the key thing. We need everything to be running the same all the time. So we need a constant blood pressure, constant level of sodium in your blood, maintain a constant weight. Your body will be striving to keep everything constant all the time, and that's the control of metabolism. So how do we actually measure metabolic health? Well, there's lots of different things we could measure, but not all of them are practical, and not all of them we could do anything about if they weren't right. So doctors and scientists really have selected a few measurements that they can take that will actually give them a clear picture of whether you have good metabolic health or poor metabolic health. So we'll just go through that list. There's 5 things really. So this is from a clinical perspective, which means it's practical, that it's something that we can do something about. So normal metabolic health is defined as having ideal measurements of a fasting blood sugar level. So it needs to be a fasting blood sugar level, because you would expect after you'd fasted overnight that your blood sugar level will be at the lowest it's going to be. Okay, so if your blood sugar level when you're fasting is higher than is expected, then that's a problem, because that means you've not been able to drop your blood sugar levels low enough while you've been fasting. So that's why we do it fasting. There are all sorts of other tests you can do for measuring blood sugar levels and things, but this is a key one that we need to know. The second one is your blood triglyceride levels. Triglycerides are a form of fat in the blood, and triglycerides are actually made from sugar. So if your blood sugar levels tend to be running a little bit high, then some of that sugar would have been turned into fat. So what tends to happen is you have three molecules of glucose tend to bind to one fatty acid molecule, and that's why it's called a triglyceride. Three sugar molecules to one fat molecule. And they're in your blood because they're en route to being stored in your fat stores around your abdomen, your adipose tissue. So while they're in transit on the way, we can measure them in the blood. So we tend to find somebody who eats a lot of sugar will tend to have higher triglyceride levels in their blood, because a lot of that excess sugar is being turned into fat. The third measurement is your HDL cholesterol. This is your so-called healthy cholesterol, which needs to be at a reasonably high level. That's deemed to be much healthier if it's at a higher level. So they can measure that as well. The fourth thing is your blood pressure. Like I said, your body likes to maintain everything at a constant level. And although your blood pressure will go up and down a little bit during the day, as if you stand up, your blood pressure rises. If you're active, your blood pressure rises. But then when you're resting, it should come down to a resting level, which should be in the normal range. So if your resting blood pressure is a little bit high, then that is suggesting that there's already some metabolic damage being done. Your blood pressure is controlled by quite a lot of different factors, but one of the things that helps to control blood pressure is the very tiny arteries that you've got in your body, which are called arterioles. This is when the arteries gradually get smaller and smaller as they go into the tissues, and just before they become capillaries, they're called arterioles. And the arterioles can open and close a little bit to help control blood pressure. if they get damaged, then they don't do that job very well, and that can lead to high blood pressure. One of the things that will damage the arterioles is our old enemy, sugar. So lots of sugar hanging around in your blood can damage the tiny blood vessels, and that can lead to high blood pressure. So you can see nearly everything is related back to sugar in one way or another. The final measure for metabolic health is your waist circumference, because this is an indication of whether you're carrying too much fat around your abdomen or not. Ideally, your waist measurement should be no more than half your height. Okay, that's a rule of thumb. So if you're 6 foot tall, then your waist measurement should be no more than 36 inches, which is 3 foot. Okay, but that's the maximum. Ideally, slightly less would be better. Also, if you're only 5 foot tall, then it would be 30 inches or less would be ideal for you. So that's a rule of thumb. And so you can work out for yourself whether you think you've got an over large waist circumference. These measures should be maintained in normal levels without you needing to take medication for it to happen. Okay, if you're needing medication, then to bring down your cholesterol levels or to bring down your blood pressure or to control your blood sugar, then that's because you already got a metabolic health problem. So ideally, you shouldn't be having medication for that. If you've got 3 or more of these parameters are abnormal, then a diagnosis of metabolic syndrome is made. Okay, so a syndrome really just means a collection of symptoms, signs and symptoms, which suggest you've got a particular disease. So metabolic syndrome is having 3 out of 5 of those measurements there. And if you've got metabolic syndrome, that increases your risk for diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. So it's very important to try and keep your metabolic health in check. Let's just have a little bit of a closer look at sugar, because I've talked about sugar a lot already. So why is sugar the root cause of poor metabolic health? What I'm going to look at here is how our bodies manage energy in our bodies. And by energy, I'm really talking about how it manages sugar, because sugar is used as energy by the body. Okay. Let's look at the normal. This is what would happen if you've got good metabolic health. So here's a nice slim girl here who likes to eat a nice healthy diet. Her energy management or her sugar management is what we would refer to as demand-led. So when her cells need some sugar for energy, they will send out a signal to say, I need energy. Okay, so that's why we say it's demand-led. That will cause this young lady to feel hungry. Her brain will send her hunger signals that she needs to eat, and hopefully she's going to eat some nice healthy foods. Those healthy foods will contain some sugar. It might have started out as carbohydrate, but by the time it's being absorbed into the blood, it's been turned into sugar. Okay, and that sugar will be taken up into her cells, used as energy, and that process is guided by the hormone called insulin, which I'm sure you've heard of. What basically happens is the insulin molecule is a bit like a key, and on the cell membrane there are like little locks called receptors, and the insulin key will fit into the lock and it will like open a door and allow the sugar to go in. That's how it's controlled. So just think of it as like a lock and key mechanism to open a door. Once the cells have had their fill of sugar and they've had as much as they need, then any leftover sugar that's still in the blood is going to be stored as a molecule called glycogen. It's just when sugar molecules get stuck back together again into a bigger molecule. And the glycogen is stored in the liver and in the muscles. And that's sort of a bit of a rapid response unit if you suddenly needed a burst of energy. So if you were going to go and exercise, or you're running for a bus or something like that, and you needed a sudden demand for sugar, then that glycogen would get broken down, go back into your blood and get taken up by the cells again. So That's what happens to the spare sugar. And more importantly, this young lady will be sent a signal to tell her that she's full and she needs to stop eating. And if she's got good metabolic health, she'll respond to that signal and she'll stop eating until there's a demand to eat again. Okay, so let's look at a slightly abnormal situation. So now we have a young lady who's a little bit plumper, and you can see that she's got an appetite for less healthy food here. So she's got chips and pizza and cakes and burgers and sugary drinks. High level of ultra processed food and sugar here. So what happens in this situation? She's going to turn her energy management into a supply-driven one instead of a demand-led one. So she's going to be constantly eating lots of sugary food. So she'll probably have something sugary for breakfast, maybe some cereals, maybe some orange juice. She might have a biscuit halfway through the morning. She might have a sandwich at lunch, might have a piece of cake in the afternoon, and then she might have pizza and chips in the evening. But there's just constant grazing throughout the day. A lot of that food is ultra processed and there's a lot of sugar in it. So she is supplying her body with constant sugar. Okay, so like eating frequently. She's going to reach a situation where her cells are just overloaded. They don't want any more sugar. They've had what they need and they don't want it anymore. And over a period of time, these cells are going to start refusing the sugar. They're going to start stopping that insulin key from going in the lock. They're going to change the locks basically, or close the locks permanently, bolt it from the inside, and stop that sugar going into the cell, because it's too dangerous to have too much sugar inside the cells. It has all sorts of untoward effects. So cells don't like to be overloaded. This situation is what we call insulin resistance. The cells have become resistant to allowing the sugar to enter, and they've shut all the doors and it can't get in anymore. So there's a lot of excess sugar hanging around in the blood, and that's very dangerous to have it in the blood. It's got to go somewhere else. The glycogen stores are probably already full and can't take any more. So that excess sugar now is going to be turned into fat, right? Hence the triglyceride levels go up in the blood. And that fat is going to be stored mainly around your abdomen. And this is why you put weight on. The other thing that's going to happen for this young lady is that because the ultra processed foods, they tend to send messages to the brain to tell you to continue eating even when you're full. The whole appetite regulation mechanism breaks down. And this young lady does not really know she's full. She's compelled to keep eating, and therefore just makes the situation worse and worse. So that's what happens when things go a bit wrong. So what enables us to maintain a normal, healthy weight? I'm going to look at the normal situation again first. So go back to our nice slim girl. First thing that the brain does, it always decides on what your weight set point is. This is the weight that your brain will try to keep your body at all the time. So remember, we need a constant environment all the time, constant internal environment, and weight is part of that. So your brain has decided what is a normal weight for you and will try to keep you at that weight. The brain also controls appetite and sends signals out to tell you when you're hungry and other signals to tell you when to stop eating. So it's important to listen to those signals. The third thing that's important here is your metabolic rate. So your metabolic rate is controlled by your thyroid gland, which sits at the front of the neck here. And your thyroid can speed up your metabolic rate and it can slow it down. And it's under control of the brain, ultimately. And the fourth thing here is another hormone called leptin. Now, leptin is produced by the fat cells around your abdomen. So it's a proportional thing. The more fat cells you've got, the more leptin you'll make. This leptin will circulate around in your blood and pass through your brain. And this is how your brain knows whether you're carrying too much fat or not. If it gets a really big leptin signal, then it knows there's too much fat on board. And if it If it gets a really low leptin signal, it knows you're too skinny. Okay, so this is how your brain knows if there's a problem or not and will respond. So let's look at the two scenarios. Say with this young lady that her weight falls below her set point. She's, for some reason, she's just not been eating and she's been very active and she's lost half a stone. What's going to happen? First thing is her appetite will increase. She'll be sent messages to tell her that she's hungry so that she'll eat and take on board more calories. The second thing that will happen is her metabolic rate will decrease. Her thyroid will alter her metabolic rate. And the reason for doing that is that she will conserve more energy. Everything will happen a bit more slowly and the calories will be burnt up more slowly. So she will conserve energy by doing that. So those two things together, eating more to take on board more calories and slowing down how fast you burn those calories, will enable her weight to come back up to its set point. And once it's at its set point, then everything gets back to normal again. On the other hand, if she's had a really good Christmas or something and she's put a bit of weight on and she needs to lose it, so the opposite is going to happen. She's going to get messages that she's not really very hungry, so that she eats less and stops taking on board excess calories. But her thyroid will get the message to increase her metabolic rate so that she burns off calories more quickly. And those two things together will help the weight to go back to the set point, and then everything's back to normal again. This is out of her conscious control. She's not aware of any of this happening. It's just happening in the background, and her weight will fluctuate very little because of this. It'll go up and down a few pounds, but she won't really have to consciously change how she's behaving. If she's listening to the signals being sent out by her brain about how hungry she is and whether to stop eating, then her weight will just naturally stay pretty stable all the time. So that's a normal situation. So obviously this goes wrong for a lot of people, and people gain weight and become overweight or obese. So what's happening? What's going wrong? Let's start out. She starts out nice and slim. This is how she was when she was younger. But she got into that ultra-processed food craze, eating lots of sugar, constant grazing, like we saw with her before. Like I said, that ultra-processed food interferes with what we call the apistat, the appetite regulation mechanism in the brain. So she's probably starting to overeat because she's not getting the proper signals through to stop eating. So this leads to weight gain, as you'd expect. She doesn't like the weight gain, so she goes on a crash diet, tries to lose the weight. And yes, she cuts the calories, cuts out the fat, does all the things you're supposed to do, goes running and whatever. Yes, the weight will come off. But her brain is thinking, why is my body not consuming as many calories as normal? What's gone wrong? There must be a famine out there. Your brain has no idea whether you are deliberately taking on board less calories because you want to lose weight, or that it's because there's no food out there, you're in a famine. It doesn't know the difference, and it's going to assume there's a famine. So it's going to respond to that, and this is a survival instinct. Your brain will respond by raising your weight set point, because it's thinking, well, if there's been one famine, might be another one on the way. I need to make sure that this body is holding as many calories as possible in case there's a shortage again. So it does the usual processes. It decreases the metabolic rate to conserve energy, and it increases the appetite. So our young lady here, she's lost her weight. She's decided she's not dieting anymore, but suddenly she's feeling really hungry because of these messages. And so she will gain weight until she gets to the new set point that her brain has decided on. And this is obviously higher than it was before. So now it's a bit more difficult for her to lose weight because her set point has changed. But she tries, she goes on another crash diet. And she loses the weight, But brain thinks there's another famine, so it's going to set the weight set point even higher. And that forces her to eat and regain weight until she reaches her new set point, because this is what her brain thinks is normal now. So she just goes on another crash diet. But this time you notice she can't lose weight back to her former slim self. She's only going back to her intermediate self. But again, the brain thinks there's another famine, and this cycle keeps repeating, and she'll keep regaining weight. So every time she crash diets, when she stops, her weight gets more and more. And this is what we know is yo-yo dieting. Some of you may have been there, I don't know, but we're going to talk about what you can do about this now. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Isabel, and she's going to continue. So I've just stopped sharing my screen.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Sue. Thank you very much for that. And I shall share my screen. Hopefully that will all work. Can you see that? Or not yet? There. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can you see that? Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just to talk about the evidence and what we know about what is effective for weight loss. So I'm going to start by talking about what we should eat, and that's particularly about the macronutrient intake that we have. So that's fats, carbohydrates, proteins. I'll talk a little bit about what the evidence says may be helpful in terms of the type of foods that we eat and the type of foods we might reduce. I'll then talk about the second question is how much should we eat? And this is all about how much energy we take in and what we do about calorie restriction or not, and bearing in mind what Sue's already said about the impact of calorie restriction. I'll then talk a little bit also about when we eat and the question of how intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating might help us with that. And then I will just also bring in those other few factors about sleep, stress, and exercise, which are also important and can affect our weight as well. So, first of all, sorry, I think I've just gone too far. Sorry, just go back one. Oh, not controlling that mouse. So, first of all, talking about what we eat, and this is, there was a big, what we call meta-analysis undertaken, where this study group last year looked at a whole series of different pieces of research. They looked at 17 pieces of research, and they looked to see what was the most helpful for weight loss. So they looked at low-fat diets and they looked at low-carbohydrate diets. And they looked at both the impact on weight reduction, but also they looked at those metabolic markers that Sue has talked about. And they were looking at specifically at people who were already obese, but these people didn't have diabetes or cardiovascular disease. They just had the weight issue. When it came to what they were looking at, for low fat, they were looking at people who were, within the studies, they were looking at studies which, where the intake of fat was less than 30% of total energy intake. And for low carbohydrate, they were looking at people taking less than 40% of their energy intake as carbohydrate, which is actually quite a high level to set it at, quite a high bar. But we'll come back to that in a moment. I'll talk also about very low carbohydrate diets. So what did they find, having done this meta-analysis? So what they found was that both low fat or low carbohydrate diets could both be effective in reducing weight. And both diets were also able to improve those metabolic health markers that we were talking about earlier. And those improvements were made regardless of the number of calories taken in by the participants. So it wasn't calorie counting, it was purely what was the mix of food in the diet. However, they found that those participants who were eating lower carbohydrate, higher fat and protein in their diets, had reduced markers of metabolic syndrome, regardless of what happened to their weight loss. So that kind of diet was good for metabolic health, whether the weight was lost or not. But the conclusion of this meta-analysis was that a combination of weight loss and changing the macronutrient composition to lower carb, higher fat and protein was the most effective way of reducing markers of metabolic syndrome. Interestingly, they also found that the more saturated fat that was eaten, the greater the weight loss. I don't think they'd been specifically expecting to find that, but that was an incidental finding. And then they also found that fiber in the diet was not associated with any changes to weight or metabolic health markers. So that's quite a helpful piece of research, I think. Have I gone the wrong way there? Yeah. This is a bit more detail, and I won't try and go through this in a lot of detail, but on the left, you'll see the low carbohydrate diets, and on the right, the low fat diets. And all those indicators in the middle, the first two are around blood pressure, then you've got the triglycerides, the HDL, the marker of insulin and glucose, and then the body weight. And in all of those cases, you'll see that the low carbohydrate diets had better improvements than the low fat diets in the metabolic markers and in body weight. And also the low carbohydrate diets were the only ones that had the positive impact of putting up the HDL measure, which you want to have a higher measure on HDL. So although they both were effective, the low carbohydrate diets were more effective in terms of all those measures. So I want to move on then to talk about lower carbohydrate diets. So the last set of studies that were analysed were looking at carbohydrates of below 200 grams, well, below 40%. But within this study that I want to talk about now, we're talking about carbohydrates of below 30 grams per day, which is a very low carbohydrate diet. It's more, this is a ketogenic diet, really. But you'll see this is, there's an organization called Virta Health in America, which is treating people with type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance with a very low carbohydrate diet. And they've published their results following 1 year and 2 year clinical trials. And they're looking at this diet compared with usual care, which is the normal American treatment of type 2 diabetes in terms of the normal diet and medication. So what do they find? Well, first of all, these are just the results from the first year, but the second years are pretty similar. What they found was that those people who were on this very low carbohydrate diet lost substantial amount of weight, on average 12% by the end of the 1 year, in terms of body mass change. So that's a substantial reduction in weight. And then they also found that all the markers for metabolic health, blue lines on the right are those people who've been through the very low carbohydrate diet. And the grey lines on the left are the people who are having usual care. And as you can see, all the blue lines have all gone, significantly in the improved direction for all of those measures. So substantially better than the usual care that they would have had they not been on a very low carbohydrate diet. And the results for HDL and triglycerides were also extreme, very positive in the same way. So a very low carbohydrate diet seems to be very effective both for weight loss and for metabolic markers. So even more so than a low carbohydrate diet. So that's some of the evidence, and fairly up-to-date evidence about the macronutrient intake. And although both low carb and low fat diets are effective, it does seem that the low carbohydrate diets have greater positive benefit in terms of metabolic health, and also probably a bit of a benefit in terms of weight loss. So moving on then to think about how much to eat and this whole issue of energy restriction, and also when and how people eat and what's beneficial. I'm going to move on to talk about some studies in that area now. So I suppose the conventional approach that we've had in the Western world in terms of weight loss over recent decades has been reduce calories in order to lose weight. So it's calories in, calories out. So people look at how much calorific value the food you eat is, and then you look at how much energy you burn doing exercise and doing your normal activities. And that has been the way we've approached it. And as Sue said earlier on, you then you have this energy reduction approach, and then you go through this cycles of going back and back and back, and the sort of the sort of constant sort of swings and roundabouts, if you like, in terms of losing weight, gaining weight, and so on. What people traditionally have done is to reduce energy intake by, maybe 500 calories a day, perhaps up to 750. And that can be difficult to stick to. And also that impact that may occur in terms of your metabolism and then your set weight point changing. So another approach around energy restriction is the intermittent energy restriction. So there are two examples I'll just talk about here. One is the 5-2 diet, where you eat normally for maybe 5 days a week, and then or 4 or 5 days a week, and then the other 2 days of the week you restrict your calories quite substantially down to about 800 calories, or quite a number of calories less, and you move between these normal eating and then restricted calories on those days. Or there's what people call the alternate day fasting, where basically you eat one day and you don't eat the next day. And again, that can be very difficult for people, and that seems to be the evidence that it's quite a difficult regime to keep to. The third approach that we've talked about before now is the time-restricted eating. So you limit the number of hours in the day that you eat, but you don't restrict what you eat during the hours that you're allowed to eat. So if you're fasting for 16 hours, then you'd have an 8-hour window to eat in. So I'm just going to look at the impact of those different ways of reducing your energy intake through those different approaches. So again, this is another meta-analysis. So this means a review of a whole lot of different studies, and this has only very recently been published. So what they did was they looked at a whole lot of studies that looked at the traditional model, the continuous energy restriction, the normal calorie restrictions that you'd have in a traditional diet. And they compared that with the studies which looked at intermittent energy restriction, either the 5-2 or the alternate day fasting. And they wanted to assess those two different approaches to see what happened. And what they found by looking at all these studies was that absolute weight loss and the percentage weight loss were greater with intermittent energy restriction, that's either the 5-2 or the alternate day fasting, than with the traditional continuous energy calorie restriction in terms of those traditional diets, calorie restricting diets. So and what they found was that using the intermittent energy restriction, weight loss of 5% was achieved, body mass, 5% in body mass was achieved in 59 days, whereas with the traditional calorie restriction diets, it took 73 days to have the same impact. So you can see a clear benefit of the intermittent approach as opposed to the continuous calorie restriction. And that actually, those results mirrored some previous meta-analyses that have been carried out and other reviews that had shown that intermittent energy restriction results in greater weight loss and metabolic improvement, more so than the traditional continuous energy restriction. So I think that a lot of evidence to show that the traditional calorie counting all the time is less good than an intermittent approach. So I'm going to move on then to talk about the time-restricted eating and the benefits of using an eating window as opposed to anything else. And so what this study looked at was the effect of time-restricted eating, looking at having a time restricted feeding of either 4 hours or 6 hours. So the 4 hours would be, you'd be fasting for 20 hours and eating within a 4-hour window every day. And the 6-hour time restricted feeding would be 18 hours fasting and 6 hours eating in terms of a window. And they looked at the impact of those two options on both weight and cardiometabolic health in a trial, which is again very recently being published. This was an 8-week study, and they compared those two feeding windows, and they found that both groups lost weight in that 8 weeks of about 3% of body weight, which is, you know, quite a good amount of weight to lose in 2 months. Both groups reduced insulin resistance, and both groups reduced oxidative stress. So, and so both groups, it basically showed that the 6 hours was as good as the 4 hours in terms of feeding window. So you don't have to go down as far as 4 because you'll still have the same impact. And they found that within the feeding windows, there was no restriction on you know, how much people ate. There was no calorie counting, but actually just by restricting the hours in which you eat to 4 or 6 hours, that led to on average a reduction in the daily intake of food of 550 calories, but without any counting of calories. So that again was a very effective way of losing weight. So that's something about the, you know, how much to eat and when to eat and how to eat. There are just a few more other factors that can affect your ability to lose weight, and I'll just run through those now. So first of all, sleep. Sleep deprivation, and we were talking about this at the beginning of the session. Sleep deprivation can be quite harmful for many reasons, but it can lead to metabolic dysregulation. So it can contribute to the all those changes in terms of your hormonal response, the insulin and so on, so that things start to not work properly. Which can affect your hunger and it can affect your appetite hormones. So lack of sleep is really not a good thing, and it's bad in terms of metabolic regulation. And also, if you don't have enough sleep, you also tend to be more likely to be wanting to eat the foods like sweet foods, salty foods, starchy foods. It just drives you more towards that end of the food spectrum, I think. That's what the research suggests anyway. So sleep is an issue. There's also a quite interesting piece of research which shows that through the day, most of us become less glucose tolerant to later on in the day. So that if you have more of your carbohydrates later in the day, then that is going to increase your risk of metabolic ill health. So if you're going to eat carbohydrates, you're better off having more of them in the beginning of the day because you're more sensitive and you're more able to deal with them at that early stage in the day for whatever reason. I don't know quite why, but it's quite an interesting piece of research around that sort of circadian rhythm issue. Second thing just to mention is stress, and stress again can have an impact on weight. It can raise stress raises cortisol levels, and that can impact upon insulin, and that may impact again upon appetite and on weight gain. So stress really doesn't help us at all when it comes to weight loss. And also cortisol, the stress hormone cortisol, it also tends to encourage weight gain where we don't want it really, around the abdomen, which again is associated with metabolic health problems. So stress, you know, the more we can manage our stress, the better in terms of metabolic health. And then finally, evidence around exercise and weight loss. Interestingly, actually, there is no evidence that exercise can lead to weight loss. It can contribute to maintaining weight loss after somebody has lost the weight, but it doesn't actually contribute to weight loss. It is clearly, exercise is always a good thing and is always good for your health in so many different ways, but there isn't evidence it contributes to weight loss. So that's just a useful thing to know, that you can't do, go running regularly and expect that you're going to lose weight. It isn't going to happen generally. So that's the evidence. So that's as much as we have to say to you today. And so very happy to talk about, those are our contact details on the last slide. We will send the slides around for you afterwards as well. And that's our, Sue and I work together we have a company called Cinnamon Days, and that's a nutritional therapy service that we provide. So that's just a contact for that. We have a Facebook page that you might be interested in having a look at. So I'm going to stop there, and then Sue and I are both very happy to talk about all of the things that we've discussed. I just have to stop sharing my screen. Let me see if I can stop sharing. Right. Okay. I think that we're now. Let me just see. So yes, have anybody got any questions or?
The thing about processed foods is that they're sort of engineered basically to have an equal amount of sugar and fat in them, because scientists have discovered that hits what's called the bliss point in the brain, and that makes you want to keep eating them when there's the 50-50 mix of fat and sugar.
I mean, I think it naturally leads you to eating less, but with all these restricted eating patterns, they say, nobody's expected to count calories or to weigh food or to do anything. The idea is that you eat what you want to eat during that eating window, in terms of how much you eat and which mix of foods and so on. So I think the other point about it, though, is that I've read research which shows that you can have the same amount of food exactly, and you can eat it over a longer period of time, or you could eat it over a shorter period of time. And what they found was that the people who ate it in the shorter period of time lost more weight than the people who ate it over a more extended period of time. So that really links to the bit about how much insulin you've got in your system, because when you've been eating, then the blood sugar rises, the insulin kicks in, and they stay around for longer. And whilst you have insulin in your bloodstream, you're not going to be using your stored body fat. So you can't, whilst insulin is around, it doesn't allow you to access the stored body fat. So again, if you eat within a shorter window, then your body has more time when it's fasting and more time when it's accessing the stored fat, which then helps you to lose weight. So it's a really interesting thing. And I don't understand all the complex changes that are going on in your body, but certainly restricting the period that you're eating within is also good for you, as we've talked about before now, because it allows your body time to do all that tidying up and the housework and all the rest of it, in terms of getting rid of old cells, getting rid of things that just need to be tidied up. And if you're eating all the time, it can't do that basic housekeeping. So again, it has other health benefits as well, in terms of allowing you to, your mitochondrial function is improved if you have more fasting time as well. So yes, but it is, I think there are lots of things we don't really quite understand about this. But the evidence seems to suggest that restricted eating is effective in terms of weight loss, and more so than general calorie restriction, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah, I know you're right. It can be quite difficult, and you have to make a specific effort to do that. And some people will have, make sure that they get the fatty cuts of meat, for example. Some people will make sure that they are, eating cheese quite a lot in their diet. Some people even make a special sort of sweets almost, or snacks out of coconut oil combined with, maybe nuts and seeds and things. as a sort of like a little fat bomb almost, but as a snack. So there's a variety of different ways that people do it, but I think you're right, and that whole bit about how much fat and how much protein is also the subject of a lot of debate. So if you reduce your carbohydrates down, what do you have instead, and how much of that should be protein and how much of that should be fat? And you know, I think the jury's out because there are lots of different opinions on that. I think if you want to make ketone bodies, then you do need, you know, quite a lot of fat, because protein will give you an insulin response, whereas fat won't give you any insulin response. So, you know, I think I don't know, Sue, do you want to say anything on that, Sue? Anything?
No, only to say that if you are going to increase fats, you have to make sure they are the healthy fats that you're increasing and not the unhealthy ones. So
of course,
don't have your vegetable oils and things like that, because they're the unhealthy fats. You know, make sure that it is the healthy fats that you're eating. But if you try to lose weight, then don't, you know, just the fact that you're decreasing your carbohydrates will mean that the fats in your diet are proportionately higher anyway, you know, because you're altering those macronutrient proportions just by reducing the carbohydrate. You'll lose calories by doing that, but the proportion of fat in the diet will be higher if you see what I mean, even though the total calories will be less.
I think I mean, fat is quite satiating. So if you're having more fat in your diet, that tends to make you feel less hungry, I think, for longer. But I think also, I suppose it depends what else is going on. And I suppose things like, you know, if you haven't had enough sleep, and if you're stressed, for example, those things can also interfere with the hormones, like I was saying, and you know, you might feel hungry even though you've eaten, perhaps because you're tired. So I think there are potentially other things going on as well in terms of the things that can affect your hunger and your feeling of satiety as well.
The thing about hunger is it comes in waves. So if you ride the wave and you ignore it, it will go away. So you'll feel hungry for 10, 15 minutes, but then if you ignore it, it will go away, because hunger just comes in waves like that, and you learn to ignore it after a while. I mean, generally speaking, an overactive thyroid gland will increase your metabolic rate and cause you to lose weight, and everything speeds up and you get a bit manic, you know. But whereas an underactive thyroid has the opposite effect. It slows down your metabolic rate and slows you down. You feel tired, you put weight on, your skin gets thicker and coarser, and your hair gets thinner. So that's the normal way that the thyroid works when it's going a bit wrong. So
you just have to, you know, I suppose, think about it, so that if you do have a bit of, you know, maybe you have a bit of, I mean, dark chocolate is actually good for you in terms of, if you go for the very, you know, very high level of cocoa, so 85%, for example, it has a small amount of sugar in. So if you had a couple of pieces of dark chocolate, 85%, you'd have very little sugar in that. But you would also then have other nutrients that you find in the chocolate, which are good for you, like magnesium and other nutrients, iron, for example. So I think obviously what you have to be careful with sugar is that it can be addictive. So if you have some, then you might want some more, and then you might want some more again. So I think as long as you're in control of it, if you like, and you're saying, well, I'll have a bit of fruit, I might just have a little bit of honey on something, or, you know, a little bit along the way. I think just I suppose just be careful about it. But yes, I think you do need to be kind to yourself as well, and not to deprive yourself of absolutely everything forever, because I think that's too hard. And
another book that I recommend is one by Ranjit Chatterjee. He's a GP. You may have heard of him. His latest book is called Feel Great, Lose Weight. And I've been reading that, and I find this a really accessible book for people who don't really want to get bogged down in the science too much. He gives all sorts of really good advice on a whole range of dietary things and lifestyle things as well, because he realizes it's about the whole person and your whole lifestyle. It's not just about the food that you're eating.